It was the winter of 1889, deep in the Bitterroot Mountains when the storms came and didn't leave. For weeks the snow fell so thick it blotted out the sun. You could walk into the forest at dawn and still feel as though you were stepping into night. Out here in these scattered homesteads and trapper shacks, people survived the cold by holding to one another, or they didn't survive at all. That morning, a mountain man named Elijah Boone had gone to check the snare lines he'd set along the ridge. He was a tall man, bearded, shoulders stooped from years of carrying more weight than a man should. His boots crunched through snow so deep it threatened to pull him under. The wind howled like something alive, pushing against him with every step. By noon, he'd found little to show for his work. The traps were iced over, bait frozen hard. It was a bad winter for the animals, which meant it was worse for the people. Elijah turned toward home, following the narrow cut between pines when he heard it, soft at first, almost lost to the wind. A voice. It was the kind of sound you almost convince yourself you didn't hear. A thin, ragged cry. He stopped. There it was again. It came from down the slope, near the creek where the ice grew thick and the snow hid dangerous hollows. Elijah gripped his rifle and started toward the sound. His breath fogged the air in short, sharp bursts. The cold bit into his skin. When he found her, she was half buried in snow. A girl, no, a young woman, maybe 20 at most, lying on her side as if she'd simply lain down to sleep. Her clothes were thin, not meant for the mountains, and her lips were cracked and blue. Snow had crusted in her hair. She blinked up at him, her eyes glassy but still searching. Please. Her voice was little more than a whisper. Please don't leave me here. Elijah didn't answer right away. You had to be careful in these parts. Sometimes desperation made people dangerous. But there was nothing in her gaze except exhaustion and fear. He knelt beside her, brushing snow from her face. You're freezing, he said, his voice low. We've got to get you up. She shook her head weakly. I can't. Then I'll carry you, he told her, already sliding his arms beneath her. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp in his grasp. When he stood, she gave a faint sound of pain, but her head dropped against his shoulder. The walk back was slow and brutal. The wind cut through him. The snow came down harder. Twice, he had to stop to catch his breath, shifting her weight so his arms wouldn't fail. She didn't speak again, but he could feel the faint tremor of her breathing. At last, Elijah's cabin came into view, a low shape against the white. Smoke rose thin from the chimney. He pushed through the door with his boot, kicking it closed behind him. The warmth from the fire hit them both, though it was hardly more than embers now. He set her down on the bed, pulling the thick wool blanket over her. Stay awake, he ordered, and went to stoke the fire. Flames caught, crackling. He filled the kettle with snow to melt for water, then moved back to her side. What's your name? He asked. For a moment, she didn't seem to hear him. Then, softly, Anna. Well, Anna, he said, you're safe now. You're not out there anymore. But even as he said it, Elijah knew that in a winter like this, safety was a fragile thing. He didn't yet know what had driven her into these mountains, or how far her trouble had followed her. Outside, the wind screamed against the cabin walls. Snow drifted in lazy spirals outside, piling up against the cabin walls until they reached the bottom edge of the window. Inside, the small log home smelled of pine resin and smoke. The girl sat where the mountain man had left her, near the hearth, her legs drawn up under the wool blanket. Her eyes roamed the room. A rifle mounted above the door, a stack of freshly split firewood, a line of tin cups hanging on hooks. Everything had a place. Everything looked cared for. He moved about the cabin without saying a word, as if he had lived in silence for years. Every sound was deliberate. The crack of kindling, the iron door of the stove clanging shut, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards. She wanted to speak, to ask his name, but something about him made her pause. His quiet wasn't empty. It was heavy, like he carried a long history that didn't welcome questions. Finally, he set a tin mug of something steaming in front of her. The smell was rich and earthy, coffee maybe, or some strong tea boiled over the fire. You'll want to drink that, he said at last, his voice low and rough, as if unused to company. She nodded, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. Thank you, she whispered. The man pulled a chair toward the far corner and sat down heavily, elbows on his knees. He watched her with a steady gaze, not unkind but measuring. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, rattling the shutters. "I don't get many folks out here," he said. "Especially not like you." She swallowed hard. "Like me?" He didn't answer right away, just glanced toward the door as if half expecting someone, or something, to come through it. "You've been out there longer than a body should be? You're lucky to be breathing." Her hands tightened on the mug. She thought of the place she'd come from, the cold faces, the way they'd turned their backs when she begged for food. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," she murmured. The man's jaw tightened, and he leaned back in his chair. "You do now," he said simply. For a long while, they said nothing, just listened to the fire crackle. But beneath that quiet, the girl could feel a question building, not just from him, but in the air between them. Why was she here? What had driven her into the snow? And why did it feel like he already knew part of the answer? Night came quickly in the mountains, swallowing the last pale light behind the jagged ridge. The wind picked up, driving snow sideways against the cabin. The girl huddled closer to the hearth, her eyes fixed on the flames. They burned higher than she'd ever seen in a stove. Not frantic, not wasting wood, but steady, as though the fire had found a rhythm that matched a heartbeat. The man rose from his chair without a word and fed another split log into the stove. But instead of closing the door, he lingered there, staring at the flames as if they were speaking to him in a language she couldn't hear. "That fire's been burning for a long time," he said finally. His voice was distant, almost reverent. "Longer than I've been here, maybe longer than I've been alive." She blinked. "That's not possible." He turned to her then, his eyes sharp in the flickering light. "Isn't it? People believe what they're told, but there are other things in these mountains. Older things. Things that remember." The girl's skin prickled. She wanted to dismiss it, call it superstition, but the warmth from the fire felt different. It wasn't just heat, it was a presence, wrapping around her, pressing into her bones. He shut the stove door at last and sat down again. "It'll keep you warm," he said, "as long as you stay near it." Something in his tone made her think it wasn't just the cold he was talking about. Hours passed. The man spoke little, but every so often he would glance toward the window, his gaze tracking the darkness as if something might move out there. The girl tried to follow his eyes, but saw only swirling snow. Still, she had the strange feeling they weren't alone in the night. When she finally dozed off in the chair, she dreamed of walking through a forest, where every tree leaned towards her, their branches reaching down as if to touch her hair. And somewhere in the distance, a fire burned, steady, unyielding, lighting a path through the dark. She woke to silence. The wind had died. The cabin was so still she could hear the faint creak of the rafters above her head. The fire, impossibly, burned as strong as when she'd closed her eyes. Not a single ember dimmed. The man was gone. Her breath caught. She called his name once, softly, but the sound felt swallowed before it reached the far wall. She stood, every joint stiff from sleep, and edged toward the door. Through the frosted window, the world outside was a field of unbroken white, except for the trail. 2 sets of tracks led away from the cabin, one booted, one barefoot. The girl's stomach turned. The barefoot prints were long, inhumanly so, with deep impressions that suggested weight far heavier than her own. And yet, no snow had fallen to fill them. They looked fresh. The door creaked when she opened it, and an unnatural cold slid in around her ankles. She stepped outside, the air biting her skin like teeth. The tracks wound away between the pines, deeper into the mountain's shadow. Far ahead, barely visible through the pale mist, a figure was moving. The man. He was walking beside something tall, thin, and bent in the middle, like it had too many joints. They moved in silence, their steps falling in perfect rhythm. The girl's first instinct was to call out, to warn him, but the sound caught in her throat. The air felt heavier now, as if the mountain itself were pressing down on her chest. She backed toward the cabin, eyes fixed on the trail until it disappeared into the trees. Inside, the fire crackled, waiting. She sank into the chair, pulling the blanket around her, and told herself she would not sleep again. But minutes later, Her eyelids grew heavy, and she drifted into a dream she couldn't remember upon waking. The man did not return that day, or the next, and still the fire burned. The snow had fallen all night, heavy and wet, swallowing the narrow trail that wound through the pines. In the early morning light, it glittered like a blanket of crushed glass, beautiful in a way that made you forget just how dangerous it could be. By the time the wind died down, most folks in Hollow Creek had already sealed their doors against the cold, content to wait out another cruel January in the mountains. But that morning, old Henry Cotter spotted something strange. He'd been walking up from the mill, his coat stiff with frost, when he saw a shape lying just off the trail, small, unmoving, and half buried in snow. At first he thought it was a deer. Hunters knew the look, a heap of fur and silence. But as he got closer, Henry's stomach tightened. This wasn't an animal. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 12. Her hair was tangled with ice, her cheeks raw and cracked from the wind. She wore no coat, just a thin, dirt-stained dress and boots that had split at the seams. Her hands were bare, curled into claws as if she tried to hold on to what little heat she had left. Henry knelt beside her, brushing snow from her face. Her lips were pale, but when he touched her shoulder, she stirred. Barely. Her breath was shallow, slow. She was still alive. He looked back toward town. Hollow Creek was a tight place, but not a kind one. Everyone knew everyone's business, and strangers weren't welcomed unless they brought something worth taking. Bringing her there would mean questions, and questions meant trouble. Still, Henry wasn't about to leave her. "Come on, girl," he muttered, slipping his arms under her and lifting her like she weighed no more than a sack of flour. She groaned softly, the sound swallowed by the wind. The walk back to his cabin felt longer than it should have. The snow seemed deeper with every step, and the trees crowded in, their black trunks closing him off from the world. By the time he reached his porch, his legs burned, and his breath came in clouds so thick they froze on his beard. Inside, the cabin was dim and cold. He laid her down on the bed near the hearth, tossing another log onto the small fire. Then he stood there a moment, staring. Who was she? He'd never seen her in town, not at the trading post or the church. She didn't carry the look of the mountain families, the Cotters, the Lanes, the Merricks. Her dress was the kind you might see on the other side of the ridge, in the flatlands where winters were shorter and less cruel. Henry pulled a blanket over her and set about warming a pot of water. He knew enough about cold to understand the danger. You didn't thaw someone too fast. You warmed them slow, or you risked killing them. As the fire crackled, she opened her eyes. Just for a moment. They were gray, the kind of gray that made you think of storm clouds rolling over a field. She looked at him but didn't speak. Her gaze slid past him, as if she was seeing something else, something far away. Then her eyes closed again. Henry frowned. Who had left her out there? And why? He'd heard rumors in town lately. Talk of a family up in the North Ridge that had vanished, leaving their cabin half-burned and their animals dead in the snow. But nobody knew the truth. In the mountains, stories grew like weeds, and sometimes they strangled out the facts. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was part of something bigger, something bad. He poured a cup of warm broth from the pot, hoping she'd wake enough to drink. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. He glanced toward the door. Somewhere out there, whoever had left her was still walking these mountains, and Henry had just brought their problem into his home. It was a bitter winter morning when Mary first appeared at the edge of town. She didn't come by carriage or wagon, and she certainly wasn't dressed for the cold. Her shoes were worn through at the toes, her coat was little more than a thin shawl, and her hands were tucked deep into her sleeves, as if hiding them from the frost. Nobody knew where she had come from, only that she was there now, standing just past the blacksmith shop, as if unsure whether she should take another step forward. The first person to see her was old Mrs. Carver, who was carrying 2 buckets of water from the well. She paused, squinting at Mary with that tight, suspicious look she gave to anyone she didn't recognize. Mary's lips moved, but no sound came out. She was trembling. "You lost?" Mrs. Carver asked. But when Mary took a hesitant step forward, the older woman took 2 quick steps back. She set her buckets down, muttered something about strays, and went inside. It didn't take long before the others in town noticed the stranger. The butcher watched her from his doorway. The tailor peeked out from behind his curtains. The children, who should have been in school, gathered at a distance, whispering about the way Mary's hair was tangled and how her cheeks were hollow like she hadn't eaten in days. She tried to speak to a few people, once at the general store, once outside the church. Each time, her voice was so faint that people leaned in, caught a few broken words, and then turned away as if they'd heard enough. By midday, Mary sat down on the edge of the wooden walkway in front of the old boarding house. She didn't cry, but her head hung low, her hands clasped in her lap. The wind had picked up, blowing dry snow across the street in sharp little bursts. She closed her eyes for a moment and swayed slightly, the way a person does when they're too tired to hold themselves upright. No one offered her so much as a crust of bread. In a place like this, people looked after their own. That was when the sound of crunching boots came from the far end of the street. At first, no one paid much attention, but as the figure got closer, it was clear this wasn't one of the townsfolk. He was taller than most men here, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat made of heavy furs that reached down to his knees. His beard was thick, flecked with frost, and there was a quiet steadiness in the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, like someone who didn't waste a single motion. He walked straight toward Mary without so much as glancing at the others who were staring. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into the satchel slung over his back, pulled out a small tin bowl, and set it down beside her. The smell of warm stew rose into the cold air, rich with potatoes, onions, and something meaty. Mary looked at the bowl, then at him. Her lips trembled. "Why?" she whispered. The man didn't answer. He simply crouched down beside her, unfastened his gloves, and took out a spoon. He dipped it into the stew and handed it to her, waiting until she took it before leaning back on his heels. The townspeople watched from doorways and windows, their whispers swallowed by the wind. Mary lifted the spoon to her lips, took the smallest sip, and closed her eyes. It was the first warmth she'd felt in days. The man didn't leave. He stayed there beside her in the snow, not speaking, just sharing the space as if to say, "You're not alone." The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world draped in a heavy, wet silence. Snow clung to the trees in thick mounds. The road to the ridge vanished beneath a waist-deep drift. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, the air inside warm enough that the girl's breath no longer came out in visible clouds. She sat near the fire, her knees pulled up, watching as the man poured water into a dented tin pot. He glanced over at her but didn't speak, letting the quiet stretch until it became almost comfortable. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Storm's not done. There'll be more tonight." She nodded, unsure why he felt the need to tell her. But the way he said it, as if he were giving her a piece of information that mattered, made her feel a strange, small sense of safety. As the day went on, he worked, chopping wood, fixing a split in the roofline with cedar shingles he'd shaped himself, setting traps along a line that wound into the spruce thicket. She followed him once, staying several paces behind, her boots sinking deep into the snow. He didn't tell her to stop, but he didn't look back either. It wasn't until they reached the creek, a narrow ribbon of black water cutting through the white, that she realized he was checking the ice. He stomped at the edge, then crouched, watching the water swirl dark beneath the frozen crust. "Too thin," he muttered. "Won't bear weight yet." When they returned, she found herself strangely reluctant to go back inside. The snow muffled every sound but the crunch of their boots, and for the first time in days, she didn't feel hunted by the cold. That night, as the wind picked up again, he stoked the fire until the flames threw shadows that reached across the walls. He set a bowl of stew in front of her, venison, potatoes, a few scraps of carrot. She hesitated, looking at the steam curling upward, then at him. "You'll need your strength," he said simply. She ate slowly, letting the heat spread through her, while he worked on some leather straps by the firelight. At one point, she caught herself watching the way his hands moved, not hurried, not careless, as though every motion had purpose. After a while, she asked the question that had been gnawing at her since she woke in the cabin. "Why'd you bring me here?" He didn't answer right away. His knife paused mid-cut, then resumed. "Because no one else was going to." Something in the tone, not soft, not hard, just certain, silenced her. She finished the stew without another word. When she curled up in the blanket that night, the wind howled against the cabin, rattling the shutters. She listened for a long time to the rhythm of him moving around, tending the fire, checking the door latch. At some point, the sound lulled her into sleep. In the dark hours before dawn, she woke once to find the fire still going strong. He was sitting in the chair by the hearth, his eyes half closed, but one hand rested on the axe beside him. She didn't know why, but it made her feel safer than she had in a very long time. The wind had not eased by the time Ezra made it back to his cabin. Snow swirled in the air like it had a mind of its own, piling up against the door, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire roared as if determined to defy the cold, but his eyes kept drifting toward the table where the bowl sat, still steaming. She'd eaten most of it, though not all, and that seemed to worry him. A person with a good appetite was a person with a little fight left in them, but when they couldn't finish a meal, well, Ezra had seen enough winters to know what that might mean. She sat in the chair nearest the hearth, wrapped in an old quilt he'd dragged from the cedar chest. It was far too big for her, the edges trailing on the floor, but she clung to it like she was afraid it might vanish. Her eyes, though, they weren't the same as when he'd found her. The wild, darting panic had settled into something quieter. Not calm, no, that would have been too much to hope for, but something watchful, cautious. "You got a name?" Ezra asked after a long stretch of silence. His voice came out low, almost hesitant, like the sound itself might spook her. For a moment, he thought she might not answer at all. She stared at the fire, fingers twisting the quilt's frayed fringe, and then finally, so faintly he almost missed it, she said, "Clara." It wasn't much, but it was enough for him to tuck away in his mind. Clara. The name fit somehow, plain but sturdy, like the clapboard church in town that had stood through a dozen storms. "Well, Clara," he said, easing into the chair opposite hers, "you'll stay here tonight. Weather's bad, and the ridge won't be passable until the drifts settle." She didn't look at him, but she didn't argue either. Ezra decided to take that as progress. Outside, a gust of wind slammed against the cabin wall, making the lantern light sway. Somewhere deep in the timberline, a tree cracked under the weight of ice and snow. Ezra glanced toward the sound, his mind ticking over the way it always did in a storm. Supplies, firewood, whether the chimney might ice over. But beneath those practical thoughts, another question was taking root. What in God's name had she been doing out there, alone, with nothing but a threadbare dress to keep the cold off? He thought of asking, but one look at her pale face stopped him. There'd be time enough for answers later. For now, she needed warmth, and rest, and the sense, however fragile, that she was safe. Ezra busied himself with small tasks, topping off the kettle, checking the latch on the window, throwing another log on the fire. All the while, he kept her in his periphery. She sat so still, it was as if she were listening for something far away, something beyond the wind and the crackle of the fire. He wondered if she was afraid it might find her here. When the kettle began to sing, Ezra poured 2 mugs of tea, setting one within her reach. She eyed it warily before taking it in both hands. Steam curled up against her face, and for a heartbeat, her shoulders eased. Ezra leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet stretch. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the only bridge you could offer. Eventually, she took a sip, and though she didn't say a word, he caught it. That faint shift, like maybe, just maybe, she believed she'd live through the night.